Early European settlers in North America viewed themselves as proud British subjects. They fully expected to enjoy the rights and protections of the Magna Carta. But there was a logistical problem. Between the English king and his colonial subjects lay 3,000 miles of ocean, meaning a simple message could take months to cross the Atlantic. Back in London, the Crown was dealing with its own severe domestic issues. In the mid-17th century, England was engulfed by a civil war and the volatile transition of the Stuart dynasty. Because of these severe internal conflicts, the English government simply lacked the resources to maintain a coherent colonial policy. They treated the early American settlements mostly as corporate shareholder ventures and largely ignored them. This extensive neglect left a massive political void along the North American coast. Left to their own devices, the colonists had to survive. When the Pilgrims anchored in Plymouth, they recognized they were completely beyond formal governmental authority. They drafted their own set of rules, the Mayflower Compact, creating a makeshift local system of lawmaking out of pure necessity. The sheer distance of the ocean, combined with a distracted English crown, meant no one was coming to manage their daily affairs. By accident, loyal subjects were forced to become independent lawmakers. Without a central authority in London dictating an economic master plan, the colonists had to build societies based entirely on the specific environments they inhabited. In the Northeast, the New England colonies faced thin, rocky soil and brutal extended winters, making large-scale farming nearly impossible. Pivoting to the ocean, New Englanders established a booming shipbuilding sector and lucrative cod industry. Because this required deep harbors, the population naturally clustered into compact towns, making it highly practical to establish local village schools and town halls. Further south, the middle colonies developed into a markedly different society. Regions like New York and Pennsylvania attracted a highly varied, cosmopolitan, and socially tolerant population. Because they were largely free from strict royal mandates dictating religion or commerce, cities like New York and Philadelphia became booming centers. Dutch, French, German, and Scots-Irish immigrants poured in, turning these meticulously laid-out ports into thriving hubs of craft and business enterprise. Moving into the Carolinas and Virginia, the landscape demanded yet another economic model. The southern colonies were overwhelmingly rural, leveraging dense pine forests for shipbuilding materials and vast tracts of land to cultivate cash crops like rice and indigo. This reliance on massive agricultural plantations built an aristocratic social structure heavily dependent on enslaved labor. It created a stark economic divide, concentrating political power in the hands of wealthy coastal planters, while independent yeoman farmers worked smaller tracts of land inland. Without a monarch forcing a single uniform policy, geographic necessity was the sole dictator of the colonial economy. The landscape itself organically engineered three distinct models of American life. This chart tracks colonial population growth, showing a steep upward climb from 250,000 people in 1690 to more than 2.5 million by 1775. The population doubled every 25 years. As the coastal cities filled up, new immigrants and restless citizens spilled westward. The untamed frontier acted as a crucial political safety valve, allowing people who were locked out of fertile coastal land to move inland and build their own lives far from the established elites. This physical expansion was matched by a drive for cultural independence. Rather than relying on Oxford or Cambridge, the colonists began to construct their own sophisticated institutions of higher education, establishing colleges like Harvard and Yale right in their own backyards. They also began to develop their own legal principles. When publisher John Peter Zenger was jailed for criticizing the colonial governor of New York, a jury acquitted him. This intense trial laid the groundwork for a free press that could operate independently of government censorship. At the same time, the religious reaction, known as the Great Awakening, swept through the towns. Preachers like Jonathan Edwards delivered thoughtful, powerful sermons that emphasized personal redemption and democratized spiritual life. By encouraging believers to connect directly with their faith, the movement weakened the status of the established state-sponsored clergy. It taught everyday colonists to rely on their own personal conscience rather than a mandated church authority. They built their own universities, established legal protections for journalists, and formed new spiritual denominations. Decades before the very first musket was fired, The colonists had already severed their cultural dependency on Europe. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the long period of English distraction ended. The monarchy stabilized, and the government decided it was time to enforce a coherent, profitable administration over its distant American territories. The crown aggressively moved to tighten its grip. It dispatched royal governors with sweeping authorities, consolidating northern territories into the Dominion of New England, and levied new taxes by executive order. But the effort collapsed. The colonists were now reading John Locke's treatises on natural rights, and they possessed generations of practical experience running their own legislative assemblies. When royal governors tried to exert their power, the colonial assemblies fought back, using the one massive lever they held, the purse strings. By controlling the voting on local taxes and expenditures, legislatures effectively kneecapped the king's appointed officials. These continuous clashes between the governors and the assemblies established fierce new precedents. Over time, these political victories hardened into an unwritten constitution, solidifying a standard of unyielding self-governance. A century of physical isolation and imperial neglect had produced a people who managed their own taxes, laws, and churches. The eventual clash with Britain was the natural collision of a returning empire and a continent that had already become self-sufficient. The United States began as a slow-moving, 175-year incubation in the dense, unforgiving wilderness of North America, long before the formal declaration of 1776. Settlers arriving on these shores, whether younger sons of aristocrats, religious dissenters, or impoverished servants, left the heavy baggage of Europe's rigid feudal order behind them. They stepped onto a social blank slate, unencumbered by centuries of established class hierarchies. Without an entrenched aristocracy to satisfy, the colonies ran on a different intellectual operating system, the philosophy of John Locke. His ideas emphasized the inherent rights of the individual and placed strict, logical constraints on the power of government. 3,000 miles of ocean, combined with the daily, practical demands of surviving and expanding on a rugged frontier, cultivated a deeply rooted democratic spirit. This autonomy was a functional reality of life long before it was ever a political slogan. This new society grew with severe friction. Look at this engraving of the 1692 Salem witch trials. A girl points a condemning finger, another has collapsed to the floor in apparent torment. These trials represent a severe societal growing pain. The court relied on spectral evidence, visions and spirits that couldn't be verified. 20 people were executed before the hysteria broke. Today, we still use the term witch hunt to describe the deadly consequences of sensational, baseless accusations against a large group of people. The accusations mapped directly onto a deep economic divide. Many of the accusers belonged to Salem's traditional, agrarian, Puritan-dominated farming community. The accused witches, however, frequently belonged to a rising commercial class of secular shopkeepers and tradesmen. The terror in Salem was a distorted reflection of a colony in transition. By the late 17th century, these early, religiously dominated outposts were already fracturing and evolving into a complex, commercial society. This map illustrates the geopolitical trap the colonies faced by 1754. France established a massive, crescent-shaped network of forts and trading posts from Quebec to New Orleans, physically pinning the British colonies into a narrow strip east of the Appalachians. The tension along this border eventually snapped. At Fort Duquesne, modern-day Pittsburgh, a band of French regulars clashed with Virginia militiamen. The commander of those militiamen was a 22-year-old surveyor and planter named George Washington. Realizing the danger, the British government scrambled to unite its fractured territories. Representatives met in New York at the Albany Congress, where Benjamin Franklin drafted the Albany Plan of Union. The goal was to create a Grand Council to manage colonial defense and handle Native American relations. The plan failed completely. Not a single colony accepted it. Steeped in Lockean ideals of individual rights and local rule, the colonial assemblies refused to surrender their independent powers of taxation to any central authority. The colonies were so fiercely protective of their local autonomy that they chose to remain divided and vulnerable to the French military, rather than yield an inch of power to an overarching government. That fragmented vulnerability forced England to step in with its superior strategic position and military leadership. The resulting conflict, the French and Indian War, ended in a decisive British victory. Looking at this 1763 map of North America, the territorial shift is staggering. France relinquished all of Canada, the Great Lakes, and territory east of the Mississippi. In a single treaty, British holdings more than doubled in size. But victory created a new geopolitical reality. By entirely removing the French threat from the continent, Britain eliminated the primary reason the American colonies required the protection of the British Army. London now faced a massive administrative crisis. They had to govern millions of newly acquired acres, integrate French-speaking Catholics from Quebec, manage complex relations with Native American tribes, and figure out how to pay down a crippling pile of war debt. The old system of benign neglect was no longer viable. Parliament realized it had to actively govern its vast possessions. This meant imposing new taxes and strictly enforcing imperial administration to distribute the costs of defense more evenly across the empire. The colonists saw this differently. Their borders were finally secure. Raised on individual rights and local rule, they viewed London's sudden administrative grip not as necessary management, but as outright tyranny. This is the Imperial Paradox. The precise measures London took to rationally organize and secure its newly won empire were the exact actions that convinced the colonists the empire was an active danger to their freedom. To understand what American exceptionalism actually means, we have to look at how this rebellion contrasts with the French Revolution that followed it. France's attempt to establish democracy devolved into terror and dictatorship. That happened because French revolutionaries were trying to violently dismantle a deeply entrenched, centuries-old feudal society from scratch, while simultaneously inventing the rights of man. The American colonies faced no such obstacle. They didn't have to destroy an old world. They had already spent a century and a half building a new, liberal commercial society in the wilderness. The unique conditions of the colonial period made a break from Europe inevitable. A century of frontier life had already forged a distinct liberal society. The Revolutionary War simply forced the British Empire to acknowledge a nation that already existed.